Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the SIPRI 2022 data to really decode how the world actually tries to govern the global arms trade. It's a highly complex, incredibly high-stakes system, and we're going to break the whole thing down together. It starts with a massive question. Who actually polices the global arms trade? You might picture some sort of global police force, but the reality is way more intricate. Instead of a single central authority, the world relies on this fragile net of international agreements, treaties, and specialized regimes. This net is constantly being cast out, trying to catch the illicit flow of dangerous weapons and tech before they can destabilize entire regions. But, as we'll see from the 2021 data, this net, it has some pretty serious holes in it. Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to cover 5 key areas today: the fragile consensus, the arms treaty, multilateral embargoes, export control regimes, and finally, EU trade controls. All right, Section 1, the fragile global consensus. To really set the geopolitical stage for 2021, we have to talk about something called dual-use items. What are they? Well, basically, these are everyday goods, software, or tech that have perfectly normal, legitimate civilian applications. But, and here is the kicker, they can also serve as critical building blocks for weapons. We're talking conventional, chemical, biological, and even nuclear weapons. So as you can imagine, restricting these specific items is absolutely crucial. It's literally the front line of global security. Now, back in 2021, we essentially saw 2 competing forces tugging at this control system. On one hand, under the Biden administration, the U.S. started re-engaging much more fully in multilateral export controls. But at the exact same time, we saw rising tensions between the U.S. and China specifically over these dual-use transfers. And that friction really threatened to weaken an already fragile international consensus on non-proliferation. Moving on to Section 2, the Arms Trade Treaty. When the states involved in this treaty held their 7th conference in 2021, they had a laser focus. They were zeroing in on eradicating the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons, sometimes called SALW, and making sure stockpiles were actually managed efficiently. You see, while giant missiles and tanks grab all the news headlines, it's actually the unchecked flow of these small arms that most frequently fuels everyday conflicts around the globe. Tightening the net right here, that literally saves lives. Now, what's really interesting about the data is the rather concerning story it tells about compliance. The numbers show us exactly how many states are required to submit an arms trade treaty report. But when you look at the states that actually bothered to submit one, it's a totally different picture. As more states join the treaty, the reporting requirement keeps climbing, right? But the actual submissions? They're basically just flatlining. It completely exposes this growing, worrying gap in global transparency. And unfortunately, that reporting shortfall was just the tip of the iceberg for the ATT in 2021. We saw a broader decline in publicly available reports altogether. We had member states just straight up not paying their financial contributions, plus, a global pandemic that completely stalled out their newly created Diversion Information Exchange Forum. Basically, this specific part of our global net is actively fraying. Okay, let's head into Section 3, multilateral arms embargoes. Just take a second to think about the sheer volume of these embargoes across different governing bodies in 2021. The United Nations alone had 13 active embargoes. Then you have the European Union with a staggering 21 embargoes in force. Some of those are just backing up UN mandates, but others are totally independent. The Arab League maintained one as well. So what we have is this vast, highly varied patchwork of restrictions all over the map. Although it's really worth noting, and this is kind of surprising, that according to the source data, absolutely 0 new multilateral arms embargoes were imposed during the entire year of 2021. Not a single one. Now, diplomatically speaking, 2021 did see some pretty rare moments of consensus. For instance, the U.S. stepped back from trying to reimpose UN sanctions on Iran, and both China and Russia actually voted for the South Sudan embargo. But when you look on the ground, the reality was incredibly stark. UN panels were documenting just constant, ongoing violations, and the deep political complexities of all this became super obvious when states, including China and Russia, actively sought to block the release of expert reports on those very violations. Moving right along to Section 4, export control regimes. All right, so there are essentially 4 primary multilateral groups, or regimes, that you really need to know about here. First up is the Australia Group, and they focus tightly on chemical and biological weapons. Next, we have the Missile Technology Control Regime. Third, the Nuclear Suppliers Group. And finally, the Wassenaar Arrangement, which deals with conventional arms and those tricky dual-use goods we talked about earlier. So these groups are all highly specialized. Their main job is just making sure member states align their own national export lists to stop the spread of these dangerous items. But of course, 2021 was still deep in the pandemic, and that heavily impacted these regimes. It severely limited their ability to have crucial political and technical discussions. In fact, only the Nuclear Suppliers Group and the Missile Technology Control Regime even managed to hold their annual plenary meetings. Still, despite all that stalled operational capacity, they did manage to scrape by and make a few minor technical amendments to 3 of the control lists. Beyond just the pandemic, though, there was some real ideological pushback happening. In November of 2021, China actually secured the narrow adoption of a UN resolution that explicitly criticized using export control measures for national security purposes. And whether you agree with that or not, it really highlights this growing, highly formal debate playing out right on the world stage about how these multilateral export tools are being applied and contested by major powers. Let's move to and see how this builds into our final pillar. Section 5, European Union Trade Controls. Now, the EU has a completely unique bureaucratic challenge on its hands. They have to somehow implement the rules of those 4 different export control regimes we just mentioned, but across one massive single market. It's like a giant puzzle. So in 2021, they actually took some pretty significant steps to tighten their own internal net. A brand new dual-use regulation officially entered into force, and the European Parliament even launched initiatives to push for much stronger centralized institutional oversight. And this brilliantly illustrates one of the overarching themes of 2021. You see, the EU and the US actually deepened their cooperation on export control issues quite a bit throughout the year. Sounds great, right? Well, yes, but as the SIPRI data clearly points out, there are still deep underlying internal differences among the EU states themselves, not to mention external friction with the US. And those differences really threaten to blunt the actual real-world impact of all that cooperation. So what does this all mean? Well, it leaves us with one absolutely crucial question to think about. Can this super fragile net of multilateral controls actually survive the growing friction between major global powers? Today we've looked at systemic reporting stagnation, completely stalled pandemic-era meetings, and very real ideological tensions over who controls these dual-use items. It is literally a constant tug-of-war between the desperate need for global non-proliferation and the incredibly messy reality of great power politics. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.